Ask anyone what the Odyssey is about, and you will hear the same handful of things. A one-eyed giant in a cave, sirens singing sailors to their deaths, a witch who turns men into pigs, a hero lashed to a mast, sailing home from a war, having adventures. That is the Odyssey the world remembers. Monsters and the wine-dark sea. Now, here is a fact that should stop you. Those adventures, the Cyclops, the Sirens, the witch, the whirlpool, the whole parade of monsters that the poem is famous for, take up about 4 of its 24 books, roughly a sixth of the poem. And every one of them is narrated not by the poet, but by Odysseus himself, out loud, at a dinner party, to strangers he is trying to impress. A man the poem repeatedly, explicitly calls a liar. The most famous scenes in the most famous adventure story ever told come to us entirely on the word of its least trustworthy character. Strip the monsters away, and what is the Odyssey actually about? It is about a soldier who cannot come home from a war. It is about a house under siege, a wife besieged by more than 100 men eating her household alive, a son growing up fatherless, a kingdom rotting. It is about disguise and lying, and the terror of not being recognized by the people you love. It is about the sacred, fragile law of how you treat a stranger at your door. It is about a marriage between 2 people who are both, at heart, con artists. And it ends, the part left out of every children's version, not with a warm reunion, but with a massacre. Odysseus comes home and butchers 108 young men in his own dining hall, and then hangs 12 of his own slave women in the courtyard, and the poem describes their feet twitching. This is the poem the whole world thinks it knows. Almost no one has actually met it.
We are going to meet it.
Not through the myth, and not through the movie. Though the timing is not an accident, Christopher Nolan has just put Odysseus back on the largest screens in the world, and audiences are walking out asking what exactly that story was really about. This is the answer the film cannot give you in 3 hours. We are going to read it the way the scholars read it, through Emily Wilson, whose translation reintroduced the poem to 1 million readers, through Moses Finley, who reconstructed the brutal world behind it, through the psychiatrist Jonathan Shea, who recognized in Odysseus the exact symptoms of the combat veterans in his care, through Eric Auerbach, who used a single scar to explain how the poem even works. 3,000 years ago, someone, we are not even sure who, or whether it was one person at all, composed the story of a man trying to get home. It is the second oldest work in the Western canon, and it may be the most misunderstood. Here is what the Odyssey is really about. Everything you need to know about the poem is compressed into its first line, and into a single word that translators have fought over for 400 years. In the original Greek, the poem opens with the word andra, man, not sing of the wrath, as the Iliad opens, naming an emotion, but man, naming a person. Tell me about a man. And then, immediately, an adjective is stuck to him, and that adjective is the key to the whole poem. Polytropos. Poly, many. Tropos, turns. The man of many turns. The man of many ways, many wiles, many twists. A word that can mean much traveled. A man turned this way and that by fate across the world, or much turning. A man who himself twists and turns, who shifts his shape, who is never straight, who cannot be pinned down. For centuries, translators reached for grand, heroic words. The man of many devices, the man of twists and turns, The resourceful man. Emily Wilson, in 2017, the first woman to publish an English translation of the poem in its 3,000-year history, reached instead for something plainer and more unsettling. Her first line reads, "Tell me about a complicated man." Complicated, not heroic, not great. Complicated as in slippery, as in hard to read, as in you should be careful with this one. That choice tells you she is reading the poem honestly, because the poem does not present a simple hero. Listen to how Wilson herself describes the man the poem is about. Odysseus, she writes, seems to contain multitudes. He is a migrant, a pirate, a carpenter, a king, an athlete, a beggar, a husband, a lover, a father, a son, a fighter, a liar, a leader, and a thief. A liar and a thief. Those are in the list, not as slander, but as description. The poem knows exactly what its hero is. This is the first thing the world gets wrong about the Odyssey. It is not the story of a noble warrior, nobly enduring. Its own opening word warns you that you are dealing with a shapeshifter, a man defined not by strength or courage, like the heroes of the Iliad, but by cunning, disguise, and the ability to be whatever a situation requires. The Greek word for that quality, metis, cunning intelligence, is Odysseus's true weapon. He does not win by being the strongest. He wins by being the trickiest man in the room. Every room. Hold on to that, because it changes how you have to read everything he tells you. The poem opens by informing you, in its very first breath, that its hero is a professional deceiver. But before we can follow this man home, we have to know what he is coming home from. Because the Odyssey is not the beginning of his story. It is the end of a far larger one, the greatest war the ancient world ever told.
The Odyssey is a sequel,
And it assumes you already know the first story. Its audience knew the whole vast tale of the Trojan War by heart, and the poem leans on that knowledge constantly without ever stopping to explain it. Here is what its first listeners knew. For 10 years, the kings of Greece had besieged the city of Troy over a stolen queen, Helen. It is the war of the Iliad, the older, grimmer poem, all rage and slaughter on the plain outside the walls. And in that war, Odysseus was not the greatest fighter. Achilles was the killer, Ajax the wall of muscle. Odysseus was something else. He was the mind, the strategist, the negotiator, the man they sent when a problem needed talking or tricking rather than smashing. In the Iliad, he is Odysseus of many wiles. The same word, the same slipperiness, the cleverest man in a camp full of brutes. And it was Odysseus who ended the war, with the single most famous trick in human storytelling, the wooden horse. After 10 years of failing to break the walls, it was Odysseus who devised the hollow horse. Build a giant wooden horse, hide your best soldiers inside it, leave it at the gates as a fake offering, and sail away as if giving up. The Trojans, triumphant, drag the horse inside their own walls. That night, the men climb out and open the gates, and Troy is burned to the ground. It is pure Odysseus, not strength, deception. A gift that is really an ambush, a trick that turns the enemy's own hands against them. Exactly the kind of scheme he will run again and again all the way home. It is worth noting that the wooden horse is not even in the Iliad, which ends before the city falls. We meet it, in Homer, inside the Odyssey, where the blind bard Demodocus sings the tale of the horse to a disguised, weeping Odysseus, who has to hide his face because the singer is singing about him. The poem's hero listening to his own legend and crying. Wilson points out the deep pattern here. The things Odysseus builds, the wooden horse, his escape raft, his marriage bed, are the products of the same practical, cunning intelligence, whether he is destroying a city or coming home to one. The mind that built the horse is the mind that will string the bow. But there is a darker thread in the backstory, and it tells you he never even wanted to go. Later tradition preserved a story the poem's audience knew. When the call to war came, Odysseus tried to dodge it. He was newly married to Penelope with an infant son, and he had no wish to leave them for someone else's stolen wife. So, of course, he faked madness. When the recruiting party arrived, they found the great Odysseus ploughing his fields with an ox and a donkey yoked together, sowing salt into the furrows instead of seed, raving. A lunatic, unfit to serve. The recruiter was not fooled for long. He took Odysseus's baby son, Telemachus, and laid him on the ground directly in the path of the plough. And Odysseus swerved to avoid killing his child, which proved he was sane. And so they took him to the war. Hold that image, because it will echo across the whole poem. At the very start of his story, Odysseus is a man who does not want to leave home, who tries to lie his way out of the war, and who is exposed by his love for his son. 20 years later, everything the poem is about, the desperation to get home, the son he swerved for now grown, the cunning that could not save him from the one war he never wanted, is already there, in a man ploughing salt into a field, hoping to be left alone. He was not. He went. And now, 10 years of war and 10 years of wandering later, he sits on Calypso's shore, having paid for that swerve with everything. Here is the actual architecture of the Odyssey, the shape of the thing behind the myth. It matters because the shape is nothing like what people imagine. The poem is long, over 12,000 lines, divided by later editors into 24 books. And it does not begin with Odysseus. It begins with his absence. The first 4 books are not about Odysseus at all. They are about his son. Scholars call this opening movement the Telemachy, the story of Telemachus, the boy who was an infant when his father sailed for Troy, and is now a young man of 20, sitting powerless in his own house while a mob of suitors devours it. We open on a household in crisis, a kingdom without a king, a son who does not even know if his father is alive, setting out on a small, frightened journey to ask older men what became of him. That is how the greatest adventure story in the world begins, with a worried young man and a house full of freeloaders. No monsters, no sea. A domestic emergency. Only in Book 5 do we finally meet Odysseus himself. And where is the great hero when the camera finally finds him? He is sitting on a beach, on an island in the middle of nowhere, crying. He has been held for 7 years by a goddess named Calypso, who loves him and has offered him immortality, eternal life, eternal youth, if he will only stay with her. And he sits on her shore every day and weeps, looking at the sea, because he would rather be a mortal who dies than a god who never goes home. That is the first image of Odysseus the poem gives us. Not a conqueror, a captive, weeping, homesick, refusing paradise. From there he sails and is shipwrecked and washes up, naked and half dead, among a people called the Phaeacians, who take him in. And it is only there, in books 9 through 12, as a guest at their table, telling the story of his journey to entertain his hosts, that we finally get the famous adventures. The Cyclops, the Bag of Winds, the witch Circe, the land of the dead, the Sirens, the monster Scylla, and the whirlpool Charybdis, the cattle of the sun, all of it. The entire canon of the Odyssey, as the world remembers it, the whole reason the word Odyssey means an epic voyage, is 4 books out of 24, delivered as an after-dinner speech. And then, this is the part that truly surprises people, the poem still has half of itself left to go. Books 13 through 24, the entire second half of the Odyssey, take place at home, in Ithaca, on dry land. There are no monsters in the back half of the Odyssey. There is a man in disguise, walking back into his own life, being insulted by strangers in his own hall, planning a slaughter. The climax of the Odyssey is not a sea voyage. It is a home invasion, in reverse. The true king creeping back into a house occupied by his enemies. So the mental picture almost everyone carries, Odysseus versus the monsters, out on the ocean, is a sixth of the poem, narrated by a liar. The other 5/6 is about a family, a house, a marriage, and a reckoning. The Odyssey is not a sea story that happens to end at home. It is a home story that contains, near its middle, a sailor's tall tale, which raises the obvious question. That tall tale, the monsters, the witch, the sirens, how much of it is even true? Return to the dinner party in Phaeacia, because it is one of the strangest narrative decisions in all of literature, and almost no one notices it. For 4 books, the most famous 4 books, Odysseus is the narrator. The poet steps back, and Odysseus himself describes the Cyclops, Circe, the underworld, the Sirens. We experience the monsters through his mouth. And the poem has spent its entire first line, and every scene since, establishing one fact about this narrator above all others. He lies. Constantly. Beautifully. As a way of life. This is not an interpretation, it is the poem's explicit, repeated characterization. When Odysseus finally reaches Ithaca in disguise, he tells a series of elaborate false autobiographies. Scholars call them the Cretan lies, because he keeps claiming to be a man from Crete. He tells one to the goddess Athena herself, who laughs, delighted, and more or less says, "Even a god would have to be clever to outlie you." He tells another to his own loyal swineherd, a long, detailed, wholly invented story of a life in Crete and Egypt and a betrayal by a Phoenician trader. He is so good at lying that Wilson calls him flatly a compulsive liar. Now hold that fact next to the dinner party. The monsters are narrated by a compulsive, world-class liar. To a wealthy people, he is actively trying to charm into giving him a ship and treasure. And it works. They load him with gifts and sail him home. He has every motive to tell a spectacular story, and no external witness ever corroborates a word of it. His entire crew, who might have confirmed the tale, are conveniently all dead by the end of it. And this ambiguity is deliberate. Wilson points out that Odysseus is drawn in close parallel to the Phoenicians and the pirates the poem elsewhere condemns. Sea people who trick, rob, and enslave, who return home rich with loot. Odysseus, she writes, is depicted as a master of deceit, a compulsive liar, and also a man hoping to return home with as large a pile of loot as he can. The line between the hero and the pirate, she says, is uncomfortably difficult to draw.
So did any of it happen?
Was there a Cyclops? The poem will not tell you, and that is the point. The Odyssey deliberately makes its most fantastic material the testimony of its most unreliable character. Some scholars read the adventures as true within the world of the poem. Others note that the poem hands us every reason to doubt them and then simply watches us decide. Either way, the effect is the same, and it is astonishingly modern. The story the whole world remembers as the Odyssey, the monsters, the magic, the wine-dark peril, is framed by the poem as a performance by a man who performs for a living. The most famous adventure in literature might be a con, which means the real Odyssey, the part the poet vouches for directly, is not the sea at all. It is the man who washed up weeping on that beach. So let us look at him. Because when you look closely at the war hero the poem actually shows you, he is not triumphant. He is wrecked. Consider what has actually happened to Odysseus by the time the poem finds him. He left Ithaca for Troy as a young husband and father, with a fleet and hundreds of men. He fought for 10 years in one of the most brutal wars in myth, and then he spent 10 more years trying to get home. By the time we meet him, all of it is gone. His entire fleet, 12 ships, is destroyed. Every single man who sailed with him from Troy is dead. 6 eaten by Scylla as he watched, unable to help. Others drowned. The last of them killed for slaughtering the cattle of the sun. He is the sole survivor of everyone he led. He arrives at Calypso's island with nothing and no one, and he stays there, wanted, comfortable, offered eternal life, and he weeps on the shore every day for 7 years. This is the hero at the center of the poem, not a man having adventures, a man who has lost his entire command and cannot stop grieving. Read that way, the famous adventures start to look different, less like thrilling escapades and more like a catalogue of a leader watching his people die, one horror at a time. The Cyclops eats his men in front of him. The cannibal Lestrygonians smash 11 of his 12 ships and spear the crews like fish. Scylla snatches 6 more from the deck, screaming his name, and he says it was the most pitiful thing he saw in all his wanderings. Circe keeps them a year. The Sirens promise knowledge and mean death. Whether or not these things happened, the emotional truth the poem is building is consistent and dark. This is the story of a man who left with an army and came back alone, and who carries all of them with him. And there is a detail people skip past. The very first thing Odysseus does in his own narration, before the Cyclops, before any monster, is commit an atrocity. Leaving Troy, he and his men land at a city called Ismarus, home of the Cicones, and they sack it. "I sacked the city, killed the men," he says plainly. They loot it, they take the women, they linger to feast. It is only then, drunk and slow, that the Cicones counterattack and the trouble begins. The Odyssey's hero does not begin his journey home as a victim of monsters. He begins it as a raider, sacking a town for plunder exactly as he had spent the previous 10 years doing at Troy. He is a soldier who does not know how to stop being one, and he carries his dead with him wherever he goes. So many of them that at the very middle of the poem, he goes down to join them for a while into the one place no living man is meant to enter.
At the very center of the poem,
Book 11, the middle of Odysseus's own narration, is the scene the Greeks considered its dark heart. On the which Circe's instruction, Odysseus does what almost no living man may do. He sails to the edge of the world and goes down among the dead. This descent has a name, the Nekia, and it is the still, cold pit at the poem's core. Odysseus digs a trench, fills it with blood, and the shades of the dead crowd toward him, thin, gibbering, hungry for the blood that will let them speak. And one by one, the people he has lost come up out of the dark. He meets his own mother. He did not even know she was dead. She died, she tells him, of grief, of missing him. 3 times he tries to take her in his arms, and 3 times she slips through them like smoke, like a dream. And he learns what a soul is, nothing you can hold. He meets the great dead of the war. Agamemnon, the king who led them all to Troy, murdered on his own homecoming by his wife and her lover. The shadow warning that hangs over Odysseus's own return. And he meets Achilles. Achilles, the mightiest warrior of the age, the man who chose a short and glorious life over a long and quiet one, who died at Troy exactly as he wanted, covered in undying fame. And Odysseus, trying to comfort him, says, "Surely you are not unhappy, Achilles. You rule as a prince among the dead." And Achilles answers with the most famous lines in the poem, and they detonate the entire value system of the world that made him. "Do not try to comfort me about death," he says. "I would prefer to be a workman, hired by a poor man on a peasant farm, than rule as king of all the dead."
Understand what that is.
In the Iliad, the whole point of a hero's life was to trade a short life for eternal glory, to die young and be sung forever. Achilles is the man who made that trade, the supreme hero, the poster child for the warrior's code. And here, from beyond the grave, that same Achilles says it was not worth it, that he would rather be the lowest, poorest, most invisible living slave, a landless nobody breaking his back for a pauper, than be the glorious king of all the dead. The Odyssey, at its center, quietly rejects the Iliad. It says the thing the warrior culture could not say, that being alive, ordinary, unheroic, obscure, but alive, in the sunlight, at home, is worth more than all the glory in the world. That is why Odysseus does not want to die gloriously at Troy or live forever with a goddess. He wants to go home and be a mortal man, and grow old and die in his own bed. The whole poem is arguing with the poem that came before it, and the argument happens here, in the dark, in the mouth of a dead hero who wishes he were a living slave. And then Achilles, the mightiest of the Greeks, asks the only thing the dead still care about. He asks about his son. Is the boy a great man now? Does he fight well? The greatest warrior who ever lived, in the kingdom of the dead, wants to know only whether his child turned out all right. Which is the other thing this poem is about. Not just wives and homecomings, fathers and sons. But we will come to that. First, the man climbing back up out of the dark carries something with him, the war and all its ghosts, and he cannot put it down. Jonathan Shea is an American psychiatrist who spent years treating Vietnam combat veterans suffering from severe, chronic, post-traumatic stress disorder. And as he listened to his patients, men who could not come home, not really, even decades after the war ended, he realized he had read their story before. He had read it in Homer. His book is called Odysseus in America, Combat Trauma and the Trials of Homecoming. Its argument is simple and devastating. The Odyssey is the oldest and truest account we have of what happens to a soldier when the war is over and he tries to become a person again, and cannot. Look at Odysseus through Shay's eyes, and the poem snaps into a terrible clarity. The returning combat veteran, Shay observed, often cannot turn off the survival instincts the war carved into him. He is hypervigilant. He trusts no one, sleeps lightly, assumes threat everywhere. He lies and conceals compulsively, keeping his true self hidden even from those who love him. He is prone to sudden, explosive violence. He drifts, unable to settle, chasing risk. He is haunted, visited by the dead. Now look at Odysseus. He trusts no one. He tests everyone, his servants, his father, his own wife, long past the point of cruelty. He lies reflexively, even when the truth would serve, even to the people who love him most. He conceals his identity for the entire second half of the poem. He is visited by the dead, literally. He sails to the underworld and speaks with his fallen comrades and his own mother. He raids a city for plunder on his way home from a war he supposedly wants to leave behind. And when he finally reaches his house, he does not weep with relief and embrace his family. He plans and executes a massacre. Shay titles one of his chapters about the raid on the Cicones, Pirate Raid, Staying in Combat Mode. That is the whole reading in 4 words. Odysseus cannot leave the war. He carries it into every encounter, and it kills the very men he is trying to bring home. This is why the Odyssey does not feel like a dusty relic when you actually read it. It is the founding document of a subject we have only recently learned to name. 3,000 years before the words post-traumatic stress existed, this poem understood that the hardest part of war is not the fighting. It is the coming home. That the soldier who survives may find that survival is its own long trial. That you can win the war and still lose the peace for 20 years inside your own head. The foreword to Shay's book was written by 2 United States senators who were themselves combat veterans. They read this ancient Greek poem, Shay says, as men who had been there. They recognized it. So the man limping home in the second half of the Odyssey is not just a king reclaiming a throne. He is a damaged soldier walking back toward a family that has spent 20 years without him, and toward a house that is no longer his. While Odysseus was gone, 10 years at Troy, 10 years lost at sea, something was happening back in Ithaca, and it is the real engine of the poem's plot. Not the sea, the house. Odysseus's palace has been invaded, not by an army, by suitors, young noblemen of Ithaca and the surrounding islands, who assume the long-missing king is dead, and who have moved into his home to compete for the hand of his wife, Penelope. And while they compete, they wait. And while they wait, they eat. The poem is precise, and the number is staggering. When Telemachus counts them, there are 108 suitors, 108 men living in another man's house, slaughtering his livestock, drinking his wine, ordering around his slaves, day after day, year after year, waiting for his wife to give up and marry one of them. They have made themselves at home in a home that is not theirs, and they are consuming it. The herds, the stores, the wealth Odysseus spent a lifetime building, down to nothing. This is the crisis the poem actually opens on. Not, will Odysseus defeat the Cyclops, but, will there be anything left of his home, his wife, and his son by the time he returns, if he returns at all? And it is worse than freeloading, because there is a murder plot underneath it. Telemachus, the son, is now 20, old enough to become a man, to claim his father's place, to throw the suitors out, which makes him a problem. So the suitors plan to kill him. They lie in wait to ambush his ship. The house Odysseus is trying to return to is not just being eaten alive. It is a place where his own son is marked for death by the men courting his wife. Moses Finley, in his classic study, The World of Odysseus, reconstructed the brutal social reality behind this. In the world of the poem, a great household, an oikos, was everything. It was wealth, power, security, identity, all at once. A house without a strong man at its head was prey. The suitors are not just rude guests, they are a slow-motion coup, an attempt to seize a kingdom by seizing its widow and murdering its heir. Penelope is not merely being courted. She is the last line of defense of an entire estate, and she is holding it, alone, against 108 men, with no army and no husband. How she holds them is the next thing the world gets wrong about the Odyssey, because Penelope is not the passive, weeping wife of legend. She is the only person in the poem as cunning as Odysseus himself. Remember that the poem does not begin with Odysseus, it begins with his son. And that is not an accident of structure, it is a second subject, running alongside the homecoming, that the poem cares about just as deeply. The classicist and memoirist Daniel Mendelsohn put it flatly in a book about reading the Odyssey with his own aging father. As much as it is a tale of husbands and wives, this story is just as much, perhaps even more, about fathers and sons. Telemachus is the boy Odysseus swerved the plough to save. He was an infant when his father left. He is now 20, and he has never known him, has only the stories, the reputation, the enormous absent shape of a father he cannot remember. He is a young man trying to become a man with no man to show him how, in a house full of louder, older, crueler men who treat him with contempt and want him dead. And so the first 4 books of the poem are the story of the son going to look for the father. The goddess Athena, in disguise, comes to Telemachus and tells him to stop moping in his overrun house and do something. Sail out, go to the old warriors who came home from Troy, Nestor, Menelaus, and ask them what became of Odysseus. But, and the ancient readers saw this clearly, the real purpose of the journey is not information. It is transformation. As one ancient commentator observed, Athena's true aim is education. The son, he wrote, would not have become worthy of his father had he not heard from his father's companions about his deeds. Telemachus does not really go to find Odysseus. He goes to become the kind of man who could be Odysseus's son. He sits in the halls of kings, is treated as an honored guest for the first time in his life, hears the great war stories, learns how a man carries himself. He leaves a frightened boy and comes back ready to stand at his father's side with a sword. This is why the poem's 2 halves rhyme. The father is journeying home to reclaim his house. The son is journeying out to earn his place in it. And they converge, in one of the poem's great scenes, in the hut of a swineherd, where the disguised Odysseus and the returning Telemachus meet. Athena strips the disguise, and the ragged old beggar becomes, before the boy's eyes, a radiant man who says, "I am your father." And Telemachus, who has spent his whole life without one, at first cannot believe it. "No, you are a god. You are a trick. My father is a story, not a man who could be standing in a hut." When he finally accepts it, the 2 of them weep, the poem says, like birds robbed of their young. Grief at the moment of reunion, because 20 years cannot be undone. The father missed the whole of his son's childhood. The son grew up on a myth. What they get is not the years back. What they get is each other now, for the killing that is coming. The Odyssey is often called the great poem of marriage, and it is. But it is just as much the great poem of the missing father, of the hole a father's absence leaves in a house and a boy, and of what it takes to fill it. Every dead soldier in that underworld left someone like Telemachus behind. Even Achilles, king of the dead, wanted only to know if his son had turned out to be a man. The poem never forgets the children the war left fatherless. It opens on one.
The popular image of Penelope is patience.
The faithful wife, weeping at her loom, waiting 20 years for her man. The very word Penelope has come to mean loyal endurance. That image is not wrong, but it is a fraction of the truth, and it misses what the poem actually admires about her. Penelope does not survive 20 years by weeping. She survives by outthinking 108 men. Her most famous stratagem is the shroud. Pressed to choose a new husband, she agrees, but only, she says, after she has finished weaving a proper burial shroud for Laertes, Odysseus's aged father. It would be shameful, she argues, to let the old man go to his grave unhonored. The suitors, respecting the custom, agree to wait. So she weaves. Every day, at her great loom, she weaves the shroud, and every night, in secret, by torchlight, she unravels everything she wove that day. The shroud is never finished. She holds off the entire mob for years with a piece of cloth that goes nowhere, a trick as elegant as anything her husband ever pulled on a monster. Emily Wilson titles a section of her introduction, Two Tricksters, and that is exactly right. Odysseus and Penelope are not hero and prize. They are a matched pair, two master manipulators, two liars, two minds that work the same way. The Greek ideal their marriage embodies has a name, homophrosyne, like-mindedness. Odysseus says it himself, that the greatest thing in the world is a husband and wife who share one mind. Their marriage is a partnership of cunning. And Penelope is more of a mystery than even that. The poem leaves a genuine, deliberate ambiguity at its heart, and scholars have argued over it for centuries. When the disguised Odysseus is finally in the house, Penelope suddenly, and to some readers inexplicably, announces the contest of the bow. She will marry whichever suitor can string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads. This is the contest that lets the disguised Odysseus get his hands on his own weapon and begin the slaughter. So the question is, does Penelope know? Has she recognized her husband, or half recognized him, and set up the contest on purpose to arm him? Wilson notes the poem allows the reading that there were older versions where Penelope was aware of Odysseus's plans, and thus proposed the contest of the bow in full knowledge that it would help further her husband's plot. The poem never resolves it. And there is a stranger note still. Penelope has a dream of an eagle killing her pet geese, and in the dream she weeps for the dead geese, the geese that represent the suitors. Wilson observes the unsettling implication. On some level, Penelope might not want her husband to come home. Her position, after all, is not obviously improved by his return. Her feelings, Wilson writes, are mixed and confusing. This is not a cardboard faithful wife. This is a full, opaque, intelligent human being whose inner life the poem guards as carefully as Odysseus guards his identity. The reunion of these two is not simple, and the poem makes you earn it through the one secret that only the two of them share. We will come to that secret, but first we have to understand the law that governs this entire world. The law the suitors are breaking, the law that makes a monster, the invisible code that the whole poem is secretly about. Here is something that startled the poem's readers for 3,000 years, and that a Victorian scholar found so striking he built a whole theory on it. The Odyssey is full of powerful, vivid, complicated women, far more than the war poem that preceded it. The Iliad is a world of men killing men. The Odyssey is ruled at almost every turn by women and goddesses who hold the real power over whether Odysseus lives, dies, or ever gets home. Consider who actually controls his fate. There is Calypso, the goddess who holds him 7 years on her island. She is not a monster, she loves him, and she offers him the one thing no mortal can refuse, and Odysseus does: immortality, eternal youth, forever, at her side. He says no. He would rather grow old and die with his mortal wife than live forever with a goddess. And Calypso, ordered by the gods to release him, delivers a bitter, brilliant complaint that lands as strangely modern. The male gods, she says, take mortal lovers whenever they please, and no one objects. But the moment a goddess does the same, the gods are outraged. She is a goddess protesting a double standard 3,000 years ago. There is Circe, the witch who turns his men into pigs with a wand and a potion, and who then, disarmed, becomes his lover and his most useful ally, keeping him a year and then telling him exactly how to reach the land of the dead and survive the journey home. She is danger and help in one figure, which is how the poem tends to draw its women. Never simple. There is Nausicaa, the young princess who finds the naked, salt-crusted, half-drowned Odysseus washed up on her shore, and who, instead of fleeing, stands her ground, gives him clothing and food and shelter, and steers him toward her parents' protection. There is a quiet, unspoken, almost romance in it. She is of marriageable age, and the great man could stay. He does not. But she is the one who saves him, a teenage girl practicing the sacred law of welcoming the stranger better than grown kings do. And presiding over all of it is the goddess Athena, Odysseus's divine sponsor, who loves him precisely because he is as cunning as she is, who disguises him, coaches him, fights beside him, and stage manages the entire homecoming. The most powerful active force in the poem, the one pulling the strings, is female. The women are so central and so much richer than the men around them that in 1897 the English writer Samuel Butler published a book arguing, in all seriousness, that the Odyssey must have been written by a woman, a young Sicilian woman who wrote herself into the poem as the Princess Nausicaa. Almost no scholar accepts Butler's specific theory. It remains, as one put it, a curiosity. But the observation underneath it is sound, and it survived even as the theory did not. The Odyssey pays an attention to women, their intelligence, their power, their grievances, their inner lives, that is genuinely unusual in ancient epic. Emily Wilson, the first woman to translate it, devotes a whole section of her introduction to them, the goddesses, the wives, the princesses, and, unforgettably, the slave girls, the women at the very bottom, whose fate we have not yet reckoned with. Because for all the poem's remarkable, powerful women, it is also built on women with no power at all, the slave girls at the very bottom of the house. And the collision between those two facts produces the darkest thing in the poem, a thing we will have to face when the killing comes. But it cannot be understood without the law that governs this whole world of hosts and guests, strangers and doorways. The law that decides who is civilized and who is a monster. There is a single idea running underneath every episode of the Odyssey, the monsters and the palaces alike, and if you do not see it, you are missing what the poem is fundamentally arguing about. The Greek word is xenia. Xenia means at once hospitality and guest friendship, and in the world of the poem, it is not mere good manners. It is the closest thing this society has to a sacred, universal law, the code that holds a dangerous, kingless, lawless world together. Here is how it works. A stranger arrives at your door. You do not know who he is. He might be a beggar, a pirate, a king, or a god in disguise, testing you, because the gods are said to walk the earth disguised as travelers, watching how mortals treat the helpless. So you take him in first and ask questions later. Wilson lays out the ritual. The guest is welcomed, washed, given a good seat, fed, and given wine. And only after all that, only once he is comfortable, is he asked who he is and where he comes from. When he leaves, you give him gifts and help him on his way. In return, a permanent bond is formed between your households, passed down for generations. This is the moral spine of the entire poem, and once you see it, the whole thing reorganizes around it. Why is the Cyclops a monster? Not because he is big, not because he has one eye. The Cyclops is a monster because he violates xenia. When Odysseus and his men enter his cave as guests and ask for the hospitality owed to strangers, invoking the gods who protect travelers, the Cyclops answers by eating them. He asks Odysseus his name and then declares his guest gift will be to eat him last. He is the anti-host. He takes the sacred ritual of welcoming the stranger and inverts it into cannibalism. That, and not his size, is what marks him as outside civilization. Wilson notes that Odysseus, approaching the island, frames the entire question as whether the inhabitants are lawless aggressors or people who welcome strangers, as if welcoming strangers were the very definition of being civilized. And now turn that same lens on Ithaca, on the supposedly civilized human beings back home. The suitors are in Odysseus's house as guests, and they are violating xenia just as surely as the Cyclops did, abusing a host's hospitality, consuming his wealth, insulting the beggar at the door. When the disguised Odysseus comes into his own hall, dressed as a ragged old vagrant, the way the suitors treat him, mocking him, throwing a stool at him, a footstool at a poor old stranger, is not just cruelty, it is the deepest crime in this moral universe. They are failing the exact test the gods set. They are, in the poem's terms, monsters wearing the faces of noblemen. This is why the poem is, at its core, not an adventure story, but a moral one. Over and over, in every land Odysseus visits, and finally in his own home, the same question is posed. How do you treat the stranger who has nothing, who is at your mercy, who might be a god? The Phaeacians pass the test and are rewarded. The Cyclops fails it and is blinded. The suitors fail it and are slaughtered. The Odyssey is a 12,000-line meditation on the ethics of the doorway, on the idea that a civilization is measured by how it treats the powerless person who shows up asking for help. 3,000 years later, that is not a quaint, antique concern. It may be the most urgent question the poem asks. And it is the reason the hero spends the entire back half of the story in disguise as the very kind of person his society is being tested on. A nameless, powerless beggar at the gate. Which brings us to the deepest obsession of the poem. Not travel, not monsters, identity. For the entire second half of the Odyssey, the hero is in disguise. Athena transforms him into an old beggar, wrinkled, bald, dressed in rags. And in that disguise, he walks back into his own kingdom, his own house, his own life, and no one knows him. He watches strangers lounge in his hall. He is mocked by the men courting his wife. He speaks to his old father and lies to him. He speaks to his wife and lies to her. He is home and utterly unrecognized, a ghost in his own story. And so the second half of the poem becomes a series of recognitions, scenes in which, one by one, someone finally sees through the disguise and knows him. These recognition scenes are the true emotional climaxes of the Odyssey, far more than any monster. The Greeks had a word for it, anagnorisis, the moment of recognition. The whole back half of the poem is a machine built to deliver these moments, each one more charged than the last. The first to know him is not a person, it is a dog. As the disguised Odysseus approaches his palace, an old neglected hound lies on a dung heap covered in flies. Argos, the dog Odysseus raised as a puppy 20 years before he left for Troy. Now ancient, useless, abandoned. And Argos lifts his head and drops his ears and wags his tail, because he knows, instantly, the master no human has recognized. Odysseus, unable to break his disguise, has to look away and wipe a tear so no one sees. And the dog, having waited 20 years for this one moment, having seen his master one last time, dies. It is one of the most quietly devastating scenes in all of literature, and there is not a monster in it, just an old dog who remembers. Then comes the nurse. Euryclea, the old woman who nursed Odysseus as a baby, is told to wash the beggar's feet, the ritual of hospitality. And as she washes his leg, her hands find a scar, an old scar from a boar's tusk, from a hunting accident in his boyhood. Her hands know it before her mind does. She looks up, and she knows him, and in her shock she drops his foot, and the basin clatters, and the water spills, and Odysseus seizes her, hand over her mouth, and threatens her into silence, because his wife is in the room, and it is not yet time. That scar and that scene became the subject of one of the most famous essays ever written about how literature works, and it tells us something essential about the mind that made the Odyssey. The essay is by Erich Auerbach, a German scholar who wrote it while in exile from the Nazis, and it opens his great book, Mimesis. He noticed something odd about the scar scene. At the exact instant of crisis, the nurse's hand on the scar, the moment of recognition trembling in the air, Homer stops. And for more than 70 lines, he tells you the entire backstory of the scar. The boar hunt, the grandfather, how the wound was got, how it healed. Only after all of it does he return and let the basin fall. A modern writer would never do this. We would hold the suspense, cut away at the peak, make you wait. Homer does the opposite. He floods the moment with light. And Auerbach's insight was that this is the essence of the Homeric style. Everything is brought fully into the foreground, externalized, completely illuminated, nothing hidden, nothing held back, no dark corners, no suspense of the modern kind. The Homeric world is a world with no hidden depths, where even a man's inmost thoughts are spoken aloud, where the past is not a shadow but is laid out in full light beside the present. Auerbach contrasted this with the opposite tradition, the terse, shadowed, psychologically hidden style of the Hebrew Bible. Two ways of seeing reality standing at the root of all Western literature, and the Odyssey is the pure example of the first. A poem in which reality is a bright, continuous, fully lit foreground, and a scar is not a secret, but a whole, illuminated life. But there is one recognition the poem holds back, the only secret it truly keeps, and it is between Odysseus and the one person as clever as he is. Everyone in the house has now recognized Odysseus. The nurse knows, his son knows, his loyal servants know. The suitors have discovered it, fatally. Only one person still refuses to accept him, his wife. And this is the strangest, most human turn in the whole poem. Odysseus has killed the suitors, cleansed the house, revealed himself, stood before Penelope as her returned husband, and she will not embrace him. She sits across the room and studies him, cold, guarded, unconvinced. Telemachus is appalled and calls her hard-hearted. But Penelope, the other trickster, is not going to be fooled by a man who has spent the entire poem fooling everyone. 20 years of suitors and liars have taught her caution. Her guardedness is not coldness, and it is not that some part of her would rather he had stayed gone. It is that she cannot let herself believe until she is certain, and she has one final test, and she springs it without seeming to. She turns to the nurse and calmly gives an order. Move the bed out of the bedroom and make it up for the stranger there. And Odysseus breaks, because he knows something about that bed that no one else alive could know. He built it himself, and he built it around a living olive tree still rooted in the ground. Carved the bedpost from the trunk, built the whole chamber around it. The bed cannot be moved. It is literally rooted to the earth. And so when she says, "Move the bed," he erupts. "Who has moved my bed? Who has cut the tree?" Revealing that he knows the one secret only the true husband could know. That is the sign Penelope was waiting for. Not the scar, not the killing of the suitors, the bed, the secret only the two of them share. And now, finally, she believes, and the reunion happens. Two guarded, clever, wary people, each of whom has just watched the other pass a test. Think about what the poet has chosen as the emotional summit of the entire epic. Not the Cyclops, not the slaughter, a married couple, both too smart to be tricked, recognizing each other across a room, through a secret about a bed built around a tree that cannot be moved. It is a symbol so perfect it barely needs explaining. The marriage is like the bed, rooted, immovable, grown into the ground itself, something that cannot be carried off no matter how long the man is gone or how many suitors fill the hall. In a poem obsessed with disguise, deception, and the terror of not being known, the deepest form of knowing turns out to be this: that one other person on earth shares the secret of who you really are. That is the Odyssey's answer to its own central anxiety. What survives 20 years of war and wandering and lies? Not glory, not the plunder, one relationship built on something rooted that the world cannot move. But we have skipped over what it cost to get to that bedroom. Because between the recognitions and the reunion lies the scene that every gentle retelling of this poem quietly deletes.
The homecoming of Odysseus
is a bloodbath. Here is how the reunion actually happens. Penelope's contest of the bow goes forward. String the great bow, shoot through 12 axes. One by one, the suitors try and fail. Not one of them can even bend it. And then the ragged old beggar in the corner asks to try. The suitors jeer. He takes the bow, and he strings it easily and shoots clean through all 12 axes, and then turns and aims the second arrow at a man's throat. What follows is one of the most sustained scenes of violence in ancient literature. Odysseus, with his son and 2 loyal herdsmen, bars the doors of the hall and kills the suitors, all 108 of them, trapped, unarmed at first, in the room where they had feasted for years. Arrows, then spears, then swords. The poem does not look away. It describes the hall running with blood, the floor steaming, bodies heaped on bodies like fish hauled out of the sea and dumped on the sand to die. The great hall of Ithaca becomes an abattoir. This is the climax the word Odyssey has somehow come to sanitize. Not a homecoming hug, a methodical, total killing of every man who violated his house. And then comes the part almost no retelling includes. The part that, when people actually read it, they never forget. After the suitors are dead, there is the matter of the slave women. 12 of the household's female slaves had, during the long occupation, slept with the suitors, some willingly, some, the poem's own language admits, by force. They were slaves, with no power to refuse the armed men who had seized the house. Odysseus condemns them anyway. He first forces them to carry out the corpses of the men they had slept with, and to scrub the blood and gore from the hall with their own hands. And then, that grim cleaning done, they are taken out to the courtyard and hanged. Together, in a row. Emily Wilson's translation renders the moment with deliberate, unsparing plainness. The 12 of them, strung up, and their feet, she writes, twitching for a little while, but not long. Wilson has spoken about her choice to translate this scene without the softening and the moralizing that earlier translators used to smuggle in, the way older versions called these women sluts or creatures to make their killing feel deserved. She calls them what the Greek calls them, girls, slaves, and she lets the horror stand. Wilson calls it one of the most haunting episodes in the poem, the culmination, she writes, of a pattern in which the triumphant homecoming of one man prevents so many other people, elite boys and slave girls alike, from ever reaching their own homes and their own beds. This is the true ending of the Odyssey's action, and it is essential to understanding what the poem actually is. The return of the hero is not clean. It is not costless. It is a slaughter, followed by an execution, carried out by a traumatized soldier who has come home and turned his own house into the killing field he never left. You can read it as justice. The suitors did plot murder. The world of the poem runs on blood vengeance, and Wilson notes the poem even offers the shadow story of Agamemnon, murdered on his own homecoming, as a warning that Odysseus had to strike first or die. You can read it, with Shea, as the tragedy of a man who knows only one way to solve a problem, because the war taught him only one. The poem holds both. What it does not do is pretend the homecoming is gentle. The most famous return in all of literature ends in a room full of corpses and 12 girls hanging in the dawn. And even that, even the massacre, is not quite the end, because the Odyssey refuses to let its hero simply arrive. We think of the Odyssey as the story of a journey that ends. The whole meaning of the word, in English, is a long voyage that finally reaches its destination, home. But the poem itself will not grant that ending. And this is the last, and maybe the deepest thing the world gets wrong about it. Two shadows fall across the reunion. The first is immediate. The moment Odysseus kills the suitors, he creates 108 grieving families. The fathers and brothers of the dead men gather, armed for vengeance. Because that is how this world works. Blood demands blood. And Odysseus has just spilled an ocean of it. The poem's final book races toward another battle, another cycle of killing with no natural end, until the gods themselves have to intervene, Athena descending to force a peace and wipe the memory of the slaughter away, because otherwise it would never stop. The homecoming does not resolve the violence. It has to be stopped by divine command, like a hand pressed over a wound. And the second shadow is stranger, and it hangs over the whole poem from its middle. In the land of the dead, back in Book 11, the prophet Tiresias told Odysseus his future, and it does not end in Ithaca. Even after he reaches home, even after the suitors, Tiresias says, Odysseus must leave again. He must take an oar over his shoulder and walk inland, away from the sea, and keep walking until he comes to a people so far from the ocean that they have never seen a ship. A people who, when they see the oar on his shoulder, will mistake it for a winnowing fan, a farmer's tool for tossing grain. There, in that place that does not know the sea, he must plant the oar in the ground and make his peace with the gods. And only then, Tiresias says, will death come to him, gently, from the sea, or away from it, in a soft old age. The man defined by the sea must walk until he finds a place that has never heard of the sea. The wanderer's rest is one more journey. Home is not the end of the road. It is a station on it. The Odyssey, in other words, quietly tells you that its hero can never truly stop. The restlessness, the many-turning nature the poem named in its very first word, polytropos, is not cured by coming home. It is who he is. He will reach Ithaca and hold his wife in the rooted bed, and then, the poem promises, he will shoulder an oar and walk away again. Later poets could not resist this thread. Dante sends Ulysses sailing off past the edge of the known world to his death. Tennyson gives him the old man's cry to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Sailing out one last time because he cannot bear to stay. They understood what Homer had planted. This is a man who does not arrive. He only ever departs. There is one more layer, and it reaches down under everything else, under the war, the wandering, the massacre. It is the question the poem opens with and never fully closes. When a life goes this wrong, whose fault is it? The gods, fate's, or the man's own? The Odyssey answers on its very first page, in the mouth of Zeus himself. The king of the gods, looking down at human affairs, complains, and his complaint is startlingly modern. Mortals, he says, are always blaming the gods for their suffering, but in truth, they bring much of it on themselves, beyond their share, through their own recklessness and bad choices. And he gives an example. Aegisthus, the man who murdered Agamemnon and stole his wife, though the gods sent a messenger to warn him not to. He was warned. He did it anyway. He earned his doom. That is the poem's opening thesis about human life. Yes, the gods send a portion of suffering, and yes, Fate is real, but human beings reliably make it worse by their own choices and then blame heaven. It is one of the earliest statements in Western literature of human responsibility. The poem is not fatalistic. It insists, from its first scene, that what men do matters, which sits in deep tension with the machine actually driving the plot. Because the reason Odysseus suffers for 10 years is, quite literally, a god's personal grudge. Early in his wanderings, Odysseus blinds the Cyclops, Polyphemus. And Polyphemus, it turns out, is the son of Poseidon, god of the sea. Maimed, screaming in his cave, the Cyclops calls on his father to curse the man who did this, to make sure Odysseus never reaches home or reaches it late, broken, alone, having lost all his companions, to find trouble in his house. And Poseidon grants his son's prayer. Every storm that wrecks Odysseus, every disaster that drowns his men, is Poseidon collecting on that curse. Wilson puts it precisely. Poseidon says little and appears rarely, but we can see his work behind every storm and shipwreck and behind every disaster that befalls Odysseus's unlucky fellow travelers. So the 10-year ordeal, the whole Odyssey, is at bottom divine revenge for a blinded son. The suffering is both the man's own fault for provoking a god and the god's cruelty for making an entire crew die for one man's act. The poem holds fate and free will in the same hand and does not resolve them. That is not a flaw. That is the oldest argument human beings have, and the Odyssey is old enough to be having it first. And here is the turn that makes the monsters mean something. Look again at what they all have in common, and you will see that every one of them is a violation of the law of the stranger, a perversion of hospitality. Wilson lays it out. Each monstrous host is a dark mirror of the guest ritual. A good host feeds you. The lotus eaters feed you a flower that makes you forget your home and never want to leave. Hospitality as oblivion, as desertion. A good host entertains you with song before you sleep. The Sirens sing a song so beautiful you will die on their rocks rather than sail home. Hospitality as fatal seduction. A good host gives you provisions for the journey. The god of the winds gives Odysseus a bag of storms that blasts him back to where he started. Circe welcomes his men to her table and turns them into pigs. The Cyclops asks the guest's name and eats him. The monsters are not random. They are a curriculum. Each one is a temptation to stop going home, to forget, the lotus, to indulge forever, Circe, Calypso, to chase knowledge unto death, the Sirens, to give up. The whole voyage is a series of invitations to abandon the journey, and the hero's only real heroism is that he refuses every one. The monsters are what the road home does to a soul. That is why they belong in a poem that is really about coming home. But there is a final, uncomfortable twist, and it brings us back to the lyre. Take the most famous monster of all, the Cyclops, and listen to who is telling you about him. Odysseus, the unreliable narrator, and Emily Wilson invites us to hear the story from the other side. In Odysseus's telling, the Cyclops is a lawless, godless brute who deserves what he gets. But look at the facts inside his own account. Odysseus and his men enter the Cyclops' cave uninvited while he is out. They help themselves to his food. When he comes home and finds strangers who have broken into his house and are eating his stores, he is, understandably, not pleased. Yes, he then does a monstrous thing and eats some of them. But notice, Wilson points out, how Odysseus, the narrator, loads the account. He stresses that the Cyclops herds animals instead of farming, that he is ugly and huge and lives apart. Morally irrelevant considerations to make robbing and blinding him feel not just acceptable, but admirable. The Greeks were, at around this period, colonizing places like Sicily, displacing the pastoral peoples who already lived there. And the Cyclops story, Wilson suggests, reads uneasily like a colonizer's self-justification, a tale in which the native inhabitant is cast as a barbaric monster, so that taking what is his becomes heroic. We only have Odysseus's word for it, and Odysseus, the poem has told us from its first line, is the man who always makes himself the hero of the story. Even the monsters, in the end, come to us through the mouth of the one character we were warned never to trust. So, what is the Odyssey really about? It is not, mainly, about monsters. The monsters are 4 books out of 24, narrated by the most gifted liar in literature, at a dinner party, with treasure on the line, and no witnesses left alive. They are the most famous part of the poem, and possibly the least true part, and the poem seems to know it. Strip them away, and here is what remains. Here is what the poem is actually, patiently, over 12,000 lines, about. It is about a soldier who cannot come home. The first and still the greatest portrait of what war does to the people who survive it. The lying, the hypervigilance, the visits from the dead, the violence that has nowhere to go, the discovery that winning the war and losing the peace can be the same act. A psychiatrist treating traumatized veterans opened this poem 3,000 years later and found his patients on every page. It is about a house under siege and a marriage of 2 clever, guarded, wary people who survive by outthinking everyone around them, including almost each other. It is about a wife who is not a monument to patience, but a mind equal to her husband's, holding a kingdom with a trick of thread. It is about the secret shared by 2 people that survives when everything else is lost, a bed rooted to the earth that cannot be carried off. It is about the law of the stranger at the door, a whole civilization's ethics compressed into a single question the poem asks in every land it visits. How do you treat the powerless person who might be a god? It is about disguise and the terror of not being known, and the moment, a dog on a dung heap, a scar under an old woman's hands, when someone finally sees you. And it is about the cost of all of it. It ends not in a reunion, but in a massacre and an execution, and then it tells you the wanderer must wander again, that there is no final arrival, that the man of many turns will keep turning until he dies far from the sea. The world remembers the Cyclops, but the Cyclops is the bait. The poem uses the monsters to get you in the door, and then, for 5/6 of its length, it tells you the truth, that the hardest journey a human being ever makes is not across the ocean, past the witch and the whirlpool. It is the journey back into an ordinary life, and an ordinary house, and an ordinary bed, after everything that has happened to you, and the discovery that you and the home you dreamed of for 20 years are both no longer what you were. That is why it does not feel 3,000 years old. That is why it is being poured onto the largest screens in the world right now, and why audiences are walking out still turning it over. The Odyssey survives because it was never really the story we thought it was. It is not an adventure. It is the oldest story we have about coming home, and about how the coming home can be the hardest part of all. Everyone thinks they know the Odyssey, almost no one has met the complicated man at the heart of it. Now you have.